Thank you, and thank you for having me here today. I am an economist by background. This is not an economist's lecture, though. I work in strategy now, which is based heavily on the evidence that we compiled over the years at Innovate UK. And really what I want to do today is talk about why it's not so easy in the real world to implement the great visions that we heard over the last hour, which I really enjoyed and fully agreed with as well. The state is minimalistic and bureaucratic, and Innovate UK is an agency that sits as an arm's length body to the Department for Business Innovation, or Business Environment and Industrial Strategy. And we are a business-led innovation. We work to, our mission is to drive economic growth, sustainable economic growth through business-led innovation. We recognise the importance of innovation to productivity and to long-term economic growth. We're led by business. Our chief executives always come from industry. Most of our staff come from industry. I'm a relative rarity as an ex-civil servant. And we aim to connect businesses to the people that can help them innovate, the collaborators, the partners, the researchers, and we fund and connect those collaborations across all sectors in the economy. That's the wrong clicker. Since we were established in 2007, we've invested 2.5 billion of taxpayers' funding. We're fully taxpayer funded. Industry match funding has taken that, taken the total value of the projects we've supported to 4.3 billion. Some results from evaluation shows that we find a good return on this investment in terms of driving jobs and growth in the UK. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we do that and the challenges of doing that. In terms of our strategic direction, at the moment we are very much at the heart of delivering the government's industrial strategy and the government's target of UK R&D intensity reaching 2.4% of GDP by 2027. It's currently at 1.7%. It is a huge task to achieve that. It's a very ambitious target. These are just some promotional lines that I'm not going to go through in too much detail, but the basic message is we're here to support innovation across the economy, all regions and all sectors, and all businesses with the potential and ambition to grow through innovation. So I'm going to talk today about the policy cycle and how we as a government agency use this and follow this to come up with and implement and critically to evaluate policy in the UK. This is taken from the Treasury's Green Book. It sets out how all government bodies should assess and implement new programmes or policies. It is best practice. It is followed widely. It starts at the top with rationale. Every government policy should have a rationale, generally an economic rationale. Why are we spending taxpayers' money on doing this is the general question. Typically the answer is either to correct market or system failures or to redistribute wealth. We're in the former category. From the rationale, we look at programme objectives. The objectives lead to various different policy options. We will appraise those options using standard techniques also set out in the Green Book, which I won't go through today. We will implement the policy, monitor it, and in time evaluate the impact it's having. We'll learn from that programme and the results will feed back into future programmes, future rationales and objectives of programmes in the future. It's really important to note, in reality, this is not a nice, smooth, linear process that we follow. We sit down and 1 week we talk about the rationale and then the next week it's the objectives and then we design a programme. It's much more iterative, it's much more messy than that, and each of these stages can inform all of the others. And today I'm going to focus on this mainly through the perspective of the evaluation part of the cycle and how the results of evaluation feed into all other parts of the cycle and how the results of evaluations of past programmes and policies influence the way we design future ones. It's not a perfect cycle. In the real world it's messy, and it's messy for a lot of reasons which I'm going to talk about today. Some of them are outside of our control, some of them are a bit more within our control, and we do what we can to manage them. Politics is quite messy. You may have seen recently in particular. We're an arm's length body because when we're supporting innovation, it's a long-term endeavour, and it's helpful to be outside of the short-term political cycle. But in reality, we are still bound by the short-term political cycle and the relatively short-term funding cycles of 3, 4, or 5 years, depending on how spending reviews are designed. Before I get into the details of the challenges we face, I thought it would be helpful to talk through a few of our programs and look at the different ways we support innovation. All of the programs I'm going to go through are aimed at doing the same thing, which is driving sustainable UK economic growth through supporting business-led innovation. But they each try and address different challenges. They each have a slightly different rationale, slightly different objectives. So our open funding is what it says. It's open to all businesses in all sectors. It enables businesses with a good innovative idea to apply for funding. It doesn't have to align with any particular government priority or policy. It's very much focused at the technologies in gestation that Carlota mentioned, the things that we don't really know that much about at the moment. It enables ideas that government isn't aware of to come forward, to get funding, and potentially to become more concrete programs in the future. Our Innovation Loans program is a relatively new program. It's kicked off last year. Again, it is what it says. It provides loans for innovation rather than a grant which is given out without any expectation of repayment. Here we expect to get the money back. It enables us to provide greater amounts of funding for later stage innovation where the path to commercialisation is clear, but the risks are still too high for a bank to provide a loan. Our Catapult Centres are a network of 10 large research and technology organisations around the UK, set up generally around a specific technology or sector and designed to bring together a critical mass of expertise or a critical mass of facilities and equipment that small businesses who wouldn't have the resources to buy them on their own can come and access, essentially subsidising it through taxpayers' funding. Our knowledge transfer network doesn't give out any funding. It is there to connect innovative businesses to, as I said, to partners, to investors, to collaborators, to customers, all of which they might need to succeed. And it's really addressed at overcoming the network and systems failures that we see. And finally, the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, a huge new program that was launched as part of the Industrial Strategy. This is our mission-orientated program. It provides funding and connections around programs set up to overcome specific challenges. This really is the state trying to give direction to innovation, trying to harness the private investment and the ideas that come out of universities and businesses to target the big challenges that society is facing. So these are all quite different programs. They're all implemented in different ways over different time periods, different amounts of funding, different stakeholders. We try to evaluate these programs under a common evaluation framework. There are many difficulties in doing this. There's plenty of good practice guidance out there of how to conduct evaluation. We've taken it and written our own evaluation framework, which is part of the reading list for this lecture. And really, for the rest of this lecture, I'll be going through what those challenges are and how we set out to overcome them in our evaluation work. Our evaluations will start with a logic model. This is a kind of fairly commonly used tool in evaluation. Here is quite a basic example. Again, starting with the rationale of the program. Why are we doing this? This leads to inputs, generally public funding. The example I put in here is a basic R&D grant program. Those inputs pay for activities. In this instance, the money we put into a program will pay for R&D projects. The outputs of those projects, technological development being a key one, are the things that happen directly as a result of those activities. These lead to the outcomes and the impacts, which for us might be new products sold by the businesses involved, leading on to sustainable UK economic growth. In reality, the logic models are somewhat more complicated. This is from one of our programs we evaluated a couple of years ago, the Sustainable Agriculture and Food Innovation Platform. There are a variety of different types of inputs, different programs coming in the knowledge transfer network at the top. The innovation platform itself providing a wide range of resources, particularly for grant funding in this instance. The activities is not just handing out grants and doing R&D projects. You can see at the top one of the key aspects of the program was trying to set the R&D agenda. In a way, these innovation platforms are a precursor of the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund in that they were set up around specific challenges, brought together a range of public actors to focus on a specific issue. The activities led to a range of outputs, not just, in fact, I think in this case, the technological developments in the outcomes column, but technological roadmaps, research agendas, collaborative partnerships forming. These led to the outcomes, which did include R&D projects, new knowledge, new skills, technological progress, higher levels of R&D spending, and so on through to increases in gross value added in the economy, and in this instance also environmental benefits. This is somewhat more complicated than the previous slide, but is also still a gross oversimplification of how the program actually operated. However, the logic model does, however simplified it might be, it forms a really important part of an evaluation. It's one of the first things we'll do informally in-house with the program team, sit down and just try and map out a rough map of, well, why do we think this program is actually going to have the impact we want it to have? Step by step, what's going to happen with the money that we're spending? When we come up with something normally much less sophisticated than this in-house, this was developed with professional researchers later on, we will use it to define the research questions for an evaluation and also the metrics framework. So if we're happy with a model like this, it immediately enables us to think, well, okay, well, what data do we want to collect if we're going to be able to demonstrate that the program is having an impact? And so we can look at each stage of this and think, well, okay, we're raising awareness. We can do surveys around awareness of programs and awareness of the issues that the program is trying to fix. In terms of forming new collaborative relationships, these relationships generally are funded through the program, and it's quite easy for us to monitor those through our in-house processes. Further down the line, it gets quite difficult to monitor increases in GVA. It's a macroeconomic statistic. We can certainly monitor it, but to attribute it to the program becomes a lot more difficult. But it enables us to start looking at what would we like to be able to measure through this evaluation, and what research questions do we want to ask. Ultimately, the main ones are we having an impact on economic growth? Are we having an impact on the environmental benefits that we're hoping to see? They're very difficult questions to answer in a reliable and robust way. And generally, we'll build up to them through simpler questions at each stage of the logic model. We put an awful lot of focus and resource into our evaluations because evaluation of public policy is incredibly important, and particularly in the UK, there is a great expectation that money that is spent through government departments will be rigorously evaluated so we can justify that spend. It's something we need to draw on when we're requesting funding for our programs, and it's something that we come under a lot of scrutiny from our parent department in Bays and also from Treasury and indeed from external sources. This is a quote from our evaluation framework. We need to measure not what happens, but what happens above and beyond what would have happened in the absence of the policy. So we're aiming to support economic growth. We're aiming to support the businesses that we fund to grow. It's not enough for us to demonstrate that companies funded by our programs grow. They're innovative companies, they're ambitious, they're aware of the support that's available to them, they're able to get together a good application for funding, they're connected, they've got good collaborations, they're probably going to grow anyway. They're probably going to be grow faster than the average company anyway. Our challenge is to demonstrate that they're growing faster than they would have done. And for this, we need to design a credible counterfactual to illustrate what would have happened in the absence of support. Again, this is tricky for many reasons, but it is vital. Our general approach is to use a control group of companies who applied to our programs but were unsuccessful. So we're honing in on a comparable group of companies who are likewise innovative, likewise aware of the public support that's available for them. We will try and narrow our control group to those companies who we wanted to fund. They had a good, solid application, but our budget didn't allow us to fund them. There's usually a large pool of those companies. In fact, coincidentally, it tends to be about 50-50 between those applications that we want to fund, that we're able to, and that we're unable to. So we have a credible control group that we can follow over a period of time and see how the difference in growth rates, see what the difference in growth rates between those two groups is. Are the companies who received a grant growing faster than those who did not? That's kind of our linchpin methodology for evaluation. Again, it's a bit of a gross simplification of how it actually works. Because even with that relatively tried and tested method these days, I say relatively, when I first started working in this field almost 10 years ago, the state of evaluation was nowhere near as sophisticated as it is now. Now there are still many problems. We've come a long way, but there's still a long way to go. So I'm going to go through some of those problems in a bit more detail, the challenges that we face when evaluating, and the mitigations that we've put in place to improve the quality and the standard of our evaluations, to give us more confidence that when we are spending taxpayers' money on supporting innovation, it is having an impact, it is justified use of funding. Okay, this was meant to come up in stages. That's okay. The first one is paucity of data. To do a good evaluation, you need a lot of data. You need a decent. Do most people have a background of some sort in statistics, basic statistics? Yeah. No. About half enough. That's okay. This should all be fairly straightforward. If you want to have reliable quantitative analysis, you need a good sample size to have confidence in the results. If I was to ask three of you what your income was, it was very unlikely that would be a representative indication of the average income of the whole room. The bigger the sample in relation to the population, the more confidence you can have in your results. One of my previous jobs was working in the Department for Work and Pensions on labour market policy. I did a lot of analysis of programs that are designed to support long-term unemployed back into work. Our data set was every benefit claim made in the last 15 years. We have millions of data points, and we could do incredibly sophisticated analysis with that and really understand how programs affected different groups. One of our largest programs a few years ago was called SMART. It was that simple R&D program that I had up in the basic logic model. We provided an R&D grant to a single company to conduct an R&D project. The intention being that they would develop a technology quicker or better, sell that technology quicker and better and for more money, and the company would grow as a result. It was a 50 million a year program. Our budget at the time was around 350 million, so it wasn't an insignificant portion of our funding. We used a 2-year cohort. So it followed a cohort of 2 years of the program, and we got a treatment group of 293 companies that had received the grant, a control group of 189 companies who had applied for a grant unsuccessfully. That's not bad. You can do some good analysis with 300 in your treatment group, but only really at a headline level. SMART as a program has 3 different types of grant. It's got proof of market, proof of concept, and development of prototype. So suddenly you're looking at maybe around 100 in each group. It's getting a little bit trickier, and you need bigger impacts to have any confidence in the results that you're getting. Beyond the 3 different types of grant, you had different values, you had different regions that the companies were in, you had different sectors that the companies were in. And it very quickly broke down to sample sizes that meant you couldn't conduct analysis on those groups. So when policymakers wanted to know whether these programs are more effective in short-term ICT projects or longer-term medical technology projects, for example, we didn't have any credible evidence to really provide evidence-based analysis. The solution that we adopted to this was, well, there are a few. We track cohorts in real time to enhance the quality of data. 2-year cohort, it's 2-year cohort of people receiving a grant. The grant itself could last for up to 3 years. So we implemented evaluation that started tracking those cohorts at the beginning of the grant, would follow them over time, and encourage participation in the survey. The program funded a lot more than 293 companies in those 2 years, but contacting them and getting them to engage in a survey was difficult. Sometimes we were going back to companies who had received funding sort of 3 years previously. People had moved on, and as a result, it was harder to build up the sample size. by engaging them early and continuing that engagement over a number of years, the participants remained more engaged in the evaluation and were able to increase the sample size. We kept in touch with the sample in between surveys. We'd send out emails and notifications, let them know we're still doing this, keep us in their mind, basically. And as a result of these techniques, in a more recent evaluation, we were able to get the sample size up to around 450. We were very pleased with 450. It's a good increase on 300. It did enable us to do more granular analysis, but we are still limited. And even if we managed to survey every company who received a grant over a 2-year period, we'd be at around 800, I believe it would have been in that particular program. 800 would be a great number, and you could do a lot of analysis. But even then, if you wanted to look at regional and sector differences, there's 10 to 14 regions in the UK, depending on how you break it down. And again, your sample size disappears very quickly. So this is an inherent problem. Innovation programs, particularly funding innovation programs, where you're providing funding for projects, will always have small sample sizes. Next issue, heterogeneity. Basically, businesses aren't all the same. It's a very diverse group. They differ by size, by region, by sector, by structure. Their objectives, their aims, what are they trying to achieve? Some are very profit-driven, some are quite socially minded. There is data available on businesses quite widely, but the data that is available is limited, basically limited to size, region, sector. It's surprisingly difficult to get more detailed business data in the UK. Some countries do better than this. And that means when you're doing analysis which doesn't involve surveys, one way to get a larger sample is we'll cut out the survey, we'll just use available databases. So we have access to anonymized government data sets from tax records, so we can look at all VAT registered businesses. But even there, we only have quite limited information about those businesses in the data sets, so we can only control for certain characteristics when we're looking to compare the impact of our programs on businesses who receive support with those who don't. So statistical models tend to assume that subjects in a control group and a treatment group are by and large the same. And what we're trying to do, as I said before, is look at the difference in impact between a group of companies who receive a grant with a group of companies who are very similar, but they don't receive a grant. And we pick that control group to try and even out as many of the differences between companies as possible. So related problems, problems related to heterogeneity. It's not just that businesses are different, but innovation programs are often targeted at particular types of businesses. And a real challenge for the evaluation is not just to look at, well, are we having an impact on this particular group of businesses? It's could we have had a bigger impact if the program was targeted at a different group? So if we're targeting a program on a particular sector or a particular challenge, the question that we'll try and answer is not just whether we're having an impact there, but could we have had a bigger impact if we looked at a different challenge? Are we getting the maximum impact with the limited resources we have available? Low observability is another problem. Basically, there aren't good data sets that cover all the things that we want to measure. The outcomes and impacts of innovation support are not well documented. The inputs to innovation is not well documented. We can get reasonable data on employment and turnover. Even that's not very good. In the UK, only large companies have to file their accounts. We can access, as I said, tax data, but only on an anonymized basis, so we can't really link it in with our in-house management data of programs. There is no systematic database which tracks R&D investment in the UK, so we don't know what businesses are investing in R&D. And the outputs of innovation are intangible. Generally, it's knowledge. Knowledge can be embedded in innovation project outputs in products, which we can measure, but it also moves with the people who create that knowledge. The people who work on the R&D projects, they can move to different companies, different industries. And once in those different companies and industries, they can apply the knowledge that they gained through the government-funded R&D project and produce valuable outputs there. That's a big part of what we're trying to do at Innovate UK. It's not about providing the companies we support with a real advantage. It's about creating new knowledge that can be applied across the economy. And those spillover effects are generally a much bigger impact from government support than the direct impacts realised through the specific projects. It is impossible to predict how that knowledge is going to flow. It's people. We don't know where people are going to move to. Technically, it might be able to track them, but it would be incredibly expensive and probably quite invasive in their lives. And it's not something we really try to do. So we have looked at some solutions to try and track these intangible outputs, to look at where wider benefits are happening outside of the direct beneficiaries of our programs. So in the evaluation of SMART that I mentioned earlier, when we surveyed the companies involved in the projects, we asked them whether they thought anyone else around them would benefit from their participation in the project. So for example, whether their customers or competitors or collaborators would benefit from the knowledge they generated throughout the project. We would then ask them what form those benefits took to build a typology of different benefits. So for example, their competitors might benefit from seeing products released to market and imitating aspects of them. Their customers could benefit through better, more innovative projects, and the cost, the value of that wasn't fully reflected in the cost of the product. And then we also asked for contact details. If they could give us some people in there, either for their customers, their suppliers, their collaborators, their competitors, so we can go and ask them about those spillover benefits. We went and did this. This whole process took about 2 years because it was over a number of different waves. We managed to get contact details for around 20 individuals in indirect beneficiaries, and we managed to speak to about 8 of them. It's a very small sample size. We didn't try and build any concrete findings from it, but there were some really interesting learnings from it. Most interestingly, the perceived spillover impacts from direct beneficiaries were very different to the actual spillover impacts reported from those indirect beneficiaries. So when we asked a company who received a grant who benefited from this and how, they might say, well, our competitors benefited from this because they could copy the project, and our suppliers benefited from this because they really learned from providing the components to it. When we went and spoke to the suppliers and the competitors, they said, well, no, that wasn't really a particular thing for us. We didn't really steal the ideas. What was interesting for us was the connections that we made, or the processes that we were followed. Still benefits, but quite different to those reported from those involved with the projects. As I say, it took about 2 years to conduct that whole process. What we mainly learned was this was not an effective way of measuring spillovers, but it was good to try, and we continue to look at different ways of doing it. Currently, there's some academic research being conducted by the Enterprise Research Centre that's using national data sets to see whether they can track spillovers from innovation policy, which I think is going to be really interesting and is worth keeping an eye out for. Fluidity. So not only are companies all quite different to each other, they also change frequently and unpredictably. They introduce new products or processes. Partly we're trying to get them to introduce new products or processes, but also outside of the projects we fund, they might have a whole bunch of other projects going on. They enter new markets, they get new customers, they can change their strategy, they can change their leadership, they can merge with other businesses, they can buy out other businesses, they can disappear, they can die. And when they die, we don't know whether it's because they've been bought out or whether because they went bankrupt and crashed. The data doesn't actually give you that information. And when a company does disappear, there's no one you can contact to ask what happened. This again makes it very difficult to track businesses over a period of time. Now, the impact of innovation support doesn't happen immediately. The average length of a project we fund is 2 years. They commonly go up to 3 years. At the end of the project, in around 60% of cases, further R&D is required to bring an idea to market. That can be a number of years as well. Once it comes to market, it can take a number of years for the full benefits of that product to be realised by the business. So if we're going to track that, we need to be tracking these businesses for a long time. When they change a lot, it becomes increasingly difficult to do that and to get a really clear picture as to how these companies we support are changing and how those changes are related to the support that we give them. It ties in strongly with the issue of attribution, which I'll come back to in a couple of slides' time. There's solutions to this. We haven't really got a good solution to this. It involves trying to build up a better picture of the companies we're supporting, of the portfolio that we've supported over the years. This mainly involves trying to use additional data sets, using third-party data sets on investment deals and on mergers and acquisitions. Enables us to get a better picture of how companies are evolving over time. And we can tie that data into our evaluation data to build a wider picture. We've also teamed up with a company that we originally supported that's using, calls it AI, it's not really AI, machine learning to scour the internet to find any evidence about company activity that might not be reported in their accounts. So looking at whether new contracts have been assigned or awards have been won, whether new collaborations have been mentioned, and it will go and track all this activity across the internet and provide us with that data in a much more digestible form. We've been trialling it for 2.5 years, and it's still quite early days in terms of building up that picture. And I guess starting to come back to a continued theme of where we try and make improvements to the way that we assess whether our programs are having an impact. It's a slow and painstaking activity that can take a number of years, and after a number of years it might be a dead end, or it might have taken us another step forward. And it really has been over the course of 10 years that we've seen a real change in the quality of evaluation of innovation support in the UK. It's through a succession of small steps, and we continue to try and make small steps with each evaluation that we do. The next problem, the penultimate problem, skewed or lagged effects. So statistical models generally assume a normal distribution of observations around a mean. There's an average, and around that average there's a tailing out on either side. There are other models that can help with this, but generally what we find with innovation is the impacts are highly skewed towards a very small number of companies that have a very high impact. One of our evaluations found that 87% of all impacts came from 5% of the projects we funded. This makes a lot of standard evaluation techniques difficult to use. Generally, they're estimating the average treatment effect. Across all the companies supported, what's the average effect of treatment? When you're using a survey analysis, it's quite likely you might miss some of those highly impacted companies. And when you take an average between a small number of very large impacts and a long tail of low or zero impacts, it becomes very difficult to build a credible picture that says this is the impact of our program, particularly when we're increasingly pressured to remove outliers from our analysis because it's skewing the underlying findings. Impacts, as I said, impacts can happen over many years, generally long beyond the duration of support, which makes tracking the companies difficult. And in initial years following support, returns can appear low or even negative. It's a problem that there's new evidence coming out around this quite a lot at the moment. We're finding that companies who engage successfully in product innovation are less productive than companies who do not. This is tricky when we're trying to increase productivity in the economy. However, when you think about it, it's not surprising. And the picture of the early automobile really struck me. That was a wonderful innovation that led to huge impacts on the economy. But when it was first produced as a radical innovation, it was not at its most effective, and it was not at its most productive. And the means of production were also new. And those things don't add up to high productivity in a company. The productivity comes after that through waves of process and organizational innovation, which we do also support, and which the outcomes of that are troubled by all the same problems as product innovation, but if not even more so. It's even harder to measure and to track. Our solutions to the skewed and lagged effects, our evaluations span long time periods. When I joined Innovate UK and set up the evaluation team, prior to that, evaluations had been done at a single point in time. We looked at a cohort of projects that had been funded a few years before, and we went back to those companies and looked at what had happened. Now we recognize that actually when we fund a project, it ends 2 or 3 years later, there's more R&D conducted after that, then things come to market and then process innovations take place. So we need to be out in the field collecting data over that period as well. Firstly, as I said, to increase the engagement of the subjects of the evaluation and to increase our sample size, but also to actually be there in the field as impacts are materializing. So I said evaluations from the start of projects to at least 3 years beyond, so that's typically 6 years from the beginning of a program. What we're finding in practice is that is not long enough, and evaluations that are reporting 6 years after a program starts are finding that the majority of impacts are yet to materialize. Yes, we've seen technological progress, we've seen new skills being developed, we've seen some products coming to market, but the majority of participants are still introducing those innovations to market, and therefore it is too early to measure the full impact of the program. So the last line there relates back to the evaluation which the complicated logic model was taken from around sustainable agriculture and food. We conducted fieldwork 6 years after the program started. That was due to be the final wave of the evaluation. We're actually going back again in 2020 next year to conduct what might actually be the final wave 10 years after the program started. In a world where you have 3 to 5 year spending reviews and a 5-year political cycle, it's very difficult to convince people to release money for something which will have an impact in 10 years' time. It's a constant frustration. It's part of the reason that we are an arm's length body. We're not directly governed by a minister, but ultimately we do work in that political cycle. And I do think that innovation policy is something which needs a longer term view. And I do agree that innovation policy should be deeply embedded in economic growth policy, which it's not here. It is in some countries. The final problem is attribution. So Innovate UK is the UK's innovation agency. We're the national innovation agency. There are many other organisations that support business growth, that support innovation, regional innovation, and that support research. There's multiple actors and programmes. Innovate UK itself is part of UK Research and Innovation, which came into form last year when Innovate UK merged with the 7 research councils that fund basic science and Research England that also funds university research. Outside of that, there's a very wide range of other actors, both at a national and local and international level, aiming to support different parts of that system. And the attribution of any so when we track a project and say, well, look, we've measured this project, we've seen the company we supported has released this new innovation that's had a wonderful impact of X pounds, even if we can be very confident that that would not have happened without our support, that is not enough to attribute that support to Innovate UK. The phrase I generally use is that our support is necessary but not sufficient to the impacts that we're observing. In the same way that the funding that went into the research base that enabled the innovation was necessary but not sufficient. That the business support and the mentoring support that a business might have received is necessary but not sufficient for the success of that company. And it becomes impossible, really, to isolate the impact of any individual program on the impacts that are observed. Solutions, again, we don't have good solutions to this. Really, what you want to see is a much greater linking up of evaluation between different programs, of the administrative data that would allow for a more detailed analysis, working across science and innovation and business support to do combined surveys to understand how all these different programs are interlinking. We've done some of this. We've linked data to other programs. We do work with our partners to understand how joint activities impact the businesses we're supporting. But the reality is, and I think one of the big flaws of the political system in all countries probably, is that they operate in quite a competitive way. When we go up for funding for our program, we are competing with everyone else who's going up for funding for their programs. And so even when we're looking to fund a program, for example, of low emission vehicles, where we're partnering with research councils and with the Department for Transport, Department for Business, Department for Energy, well, now Department for Energy is part of the Department for Business. We can put in joint submissions, but we're still competing for a limited pot of funding. And it does reduce the ability to collaborate across government and the ability to come up with joint long-term programs. Innovation is a joint and long-term initiative. I don't see a solution to this. What we do in the meantime is we try and demonstrate that the programs that we fund are necessary, even if they're not sufficient. And through data linking and through working with other organisations, we try and understand how different interventions at different times build up to an aggregated impact. Other organisations, including Nesta, have been working on this as well, compiling data from local support schemes around the UK to provide a sub-national picture and how all that builds up underneath the national support as well. Zooming in the picture on the top right hand there, this is a map of the science innovation system that was done by, who was this? The Dowling Review a few years ago, published by Bayes. Innovate UK is down here in the corner. These are the catapult centres, catalysts, collaborative R&D, smarts in there somewhere, all the different programs that we run. The red circles in the bottom right-hand corner are the research councils. We've now merged with them to form UKRI. Obviously, universities and businesses are a really important part of the innovation system. We've got some local support schemes on the left. We've got EU in the top left, UK government and other government departments which have some form of innovation or growth remit in their area. National academies, learned institutions, other funding councils in the UK, the devolved administrations on the right-hand side there. Any business we fund is unlikely to only have been supported by one of our programs. They're going to have interacted with all sorts of other parts of the system. And so coming up with a way to credibly evaluate how a grant for an R&D project might have impacted the growth of that company is very difficult. So, in summary, innovation support is a complex environment. The usual processes for appraising and evaluating policy are particularly challenging in this area. It's challenging in most areas. For innovation, there are a lot of challenges that exacerbate these. There are steps that can be taken to mitigate these challenges, and we have taken as many as have been possible. We continue to try and take steps. But in reality, what is needed is more of a systems approach, not just to policy, as we've seen in the previous lecture as well, and we see with the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund. We try to move beyond looking at how a single program might help a company to grow. We look at how a system of programs can help an economy to grow and to overcome challenges. That's more likely to be an effective approach to policy. It's also more likely to be an effective approach to evaluation. And as we change the way that we support innovation in the UK, as I think we are doing with the programs that we're seeing coming through at the moment with the industrial strategy, and I would like to think we'll become in line with Carlota's vision, then we also need to look at how we evaluate those policies and whether fundamental changes to how they evaluate those programs need to be made as well. I shall leave it there.